Hi there. I already have a set of lectures on the Republic posted on YouTube, but I decided I wanted to give a second set of lectures. The Republic is a great book, and you can read it many times and learn very new things every time. There are also many different ways you can approach it. You can take different themes as your sort of guiding orientation going through it. So I thought I would do another reading of the Republic, taking my orientation from some different themes than I did in that other set of lectures. But also my book on the Republic, Politics, Money and Persuasion, has just come out. And the other lecture course is, largely based on ideas that were in my mind when I was writing that book. But it's out now, so maybe these will be some new ideas. Maybe they'll produce a new book. We'll see. Anyway, I want to start at the beginning, then the beginning of Book I of the Republic. And, I'll largely refer to Bloom's translation because it's pretty accurate. But the first word of the Republic is not the first word that comes up in Bloom's book. Bloom's first word is Socrates, a word that does not occur in the Greek text at that point. And it says, Socrates, I went down to Piraeus. Right? The Greek text, this is the text of Adam. The Greek text, the first word is katabane, which means I went down. Katabane is a Greek word made out of a couple of other components. Kata, meaning down, and bino, meaning I go. And so katabane is just a verb that means, I go down, to go down. But it's pretty significant. The verb is significant in other ways. In Greek culture generally, but more broadly, there's a very particular going down that is quite famous, and that's a going down to the underworld. And so you will see reference to a katabasis, a going down, as a sort of, literary and mythological trope or whatever pertaining to journeys to the underworld. So when you see the word I went down, it already has a sort of deeper resonance than just describing the activity of moving your body to a lower spot. Plus, anybody who has read the Republic will know that right in the middle, in a very prominent and very important place, Socrates is going to tell a story about going down into a cave. And so many scholars have noticed this first word and said, he's starting here, and you should be reading that in light of the things he's going to say with respect to the cave, and perhaps thinking of that in light of travels to the underworld and so on. And that, I think, is all very true and very important. Anyway, that first word is katabane. So I want to mention that he begins there. Unlike other scholars, though, I'm not going to dwell on that. Not because it's not important, but just because that's not the theme I want to pick up on. But I wanted to mention it because I think one thing that's striking is that the very first thing he says is, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday, etc., etc., and finishes that little remark. And then the next thing he says is katidon, which Bloom translates as catching sight of us. Not a wrong translation, although I don't think it's quite the right one here, but I will come back to his translation. But I want to tell you what the Greek word is. It's katidon. It means looking down. So Socrates begins his little narration in the Republic by saying, I went down. And the next thing he says is looking down. Why do I emphasize that? Just because of that prefix kata. Katabino is the word in the one case, and kata horan, looking down, in the other case, is the core of the word. So the Republic starts off with two, I think, quite pronounced uses of kata verbs. Before talking about the things that are said in the Republic, I want to just take a moment then to think about that issue of kata, again, in a larger context. So I already said, the katabane should remind you of a katabasis in Greek mythology and so on. Well, there's another very famous talk about kata in general, and that is from Heraclitus. In fragment B60 in the Diels Krantz numbering, Heraclitus says, Hodos anakato mia kai hoite. the way up and down are one and the same. Why would Heraclitus have so much thought it important to emphasize that the way up and the way down, two things that you would typically think of as opposites, are the same? I mean, I think that's a pretty prosaic interpretation, not meaningless by any means, but pretty simple. And that is, if you think of an actual road or any road, in and of itself, the road doesn't go in a direction, right? You use the road to go this way or to go that way, but the road is kind of indifferent to which direction you go. So the road facilitating these two opposed movements itself is defined by neither, right? And so the way up and the way down are that way. So in other words, you take the same road to go up as you take to go down. Road up, road down, one and the same. As you will see when we go on to talk about justice a little bit later in the context of Polemarchus' exchange with Socrates, you'll see that the point I just made about the road, it being sort of indifferently the same and not definable by the two opposite trajectories it makes possible, that is an important point. But I wonder if there's also, if there are more important points. And I think there are. Let's talk at a sort of a very, very general level. Often you have to kind of do the opposite of what you think to get somewhere. If you want to be a painter, you might want to paint pictures of beautiful flowers or something like that. But that's often not the first thing you will do. What you have to do instead is, learn how to hold the paintbrush and learn how to mix your paints or something like that. So sometimes, more than sometimes, very often, the shortest way to your goal is taking what seems like a detour, right? Whereas if you try, with some things, if you try to do that thing right away, you probably won't do that well. And if you just think, I'm just going to keep pounding at this thing, it'll take you a very, very long time to get to the point you want to get to. Whereas if you go through this other route of study or whatever, you get there more quickly. I mean, another very classic one is that sort of famous saying, set something free. If it comes back to you, it's yours. If it goes away, it never was. The point there is you want to hold this thing close to you. But if you try to force it close, you're just making it a prisoner. And so in that way, you kind of lose it. You kind of lose the affection of whoever it is, person or whatever. Whereas if you let the person go, which is the opposite of what you want don't want them to go, that very well may be the thing that makes them look upon you kindly and want to come back to you. I mean, maybe that's an experience people have with their children. The way to have your children be close to you is not to try to force them to be close. It's to facilitate their independence. And as they become independent people, they may very well come to respect you for the mature and respectful way you treated them. And so in that sense, letting them go is actually what brings them close, right? So those are just a few sort of familiar examples, I think, that show that, so to speak, the shortest distance between 2 points is not always a straight line. Sometimes you have to take a kind of a detour in existential matters. So back to the way up and the way down. Could there be a similar meaning to the way up and the way down? I think so. I mean, I think especially if someone like, Jesus and the kinds of values we associate with the figure of Jesus. He's the Son of God. He's supposed to be the highest, the greatest person, the purest person. So people look to Jesus as being, the great one, whatever. And what does Jesus do? He associates with prostitutes and lepers and the poor. He associates with people who aren't liked, the destitute, the despised. And so Jesus' point is that, the way to heaven, the way up, is by going into the things that you might have thought are the bottom, the things that seem like the bad, nasty things you don't want to be part of. But I think if you sort of think of Jesus's model, you can see a sense to that idea that the way up and the way down are one and the same. That is quite a bit richer than just that observation about the fact that the road itself can be taken in either direction. So and I mean, I think that point I was just making about Jesus and all these themes I'm sort of trying to bring out about sort of opposites and so on. I think, in fact, you will see those ideas are packed into the sorts of things that Socrates is going to talk about in Plato's Republic. So Socrates, at one level, is just saying a very normal thing. I went down to the Piraeus. Okay, that's fine. We can notice that might have a kind of deeper metaphorical sense or deeper resonance with this notion of the katabasis, or with the related theme of his talking about the cave that will come up here. So that's important. And then I want to add this further layer on top of that. Yeah, okay, let's say in any one of those deeper senses he's going down. I wonder if this other familiar reference that the way down and the way up are the same, I wonder if that can be brought out here. I'm saying I wonder. Well, you can probably guess I think the answer is yes, and I think that as we eventually work through the book, we'll see why. But also, as I said, I'm not really going to focus on that right now, and I don't know if I'm actually ever going to come back and talk about that directly, although I might. But I want to talk about another verb, this katidon verb. Kathoran, I guess, would be or kathoraho, I guess, would be the most basic form of the verb. I want to talk about that verb, where I think issues very similar to these ones I'm bringing up about katabane, I went down, where issues like that come up again and are pretty relevant. So, catching sight of us from afar is what Bloom says in his translation. Catching sight of us from afar as we were pressing homewards. Polemarchus ordered us to stop. Well, he ordered his slave to come down and order us to stop. Bloom translates that as catching sight of. That's not wrong as a translation of the verb kathorao. Kathorao, as I mentioned before, is made by basically putting together two different Greek words, kata and horao, down, and I see. And so it does have, most straightforwardly, the meaning look down. I look down. But it's also true that in many cases Greek verbs, kata is a prefix that can be added to Greek verbs, not so much to specifically mean down, but to just kind of add an emphasis, to say a sort of special whatever that verb is. And so Bloom's translation, catch sight of, is Bloom interpreting the word in that way, that, of course you can say I see something, but we sort of are emphasizing a particular kind of seeing when we say, oh, I caught sight of it. I think an even more basic English word that might capture that more would just be notice. Because oftentimes you might say, oh yeah, I saw it, but I didn't notice, blah, blah, blah. Right? And so when we do say notice, we're still talking about seeing, but we're saying, really seeing. Oh, I saw it, but I didn't notice. That's sort of like saying I saw it, but I didn't really see. I think something like that kind of intensification is what the prefix kata sometimes gives to these Greek verbs. So kathorao would mean like really saw. Right? And as I say, I think notice captures that. One of the reasons that I want to pick the word notice is because it is a familiar verb with that intensification added, seeing verb with that intensification, but it does also mean basically what Bloom says, catching sight of. I caught sight of it. It's a very similar thing. It's like it captures this idea that you saw something that was there to be seen, but it would have been possible for it to escape your notice. And I think that is the particular meaning that kathoraho has in many cases in this book. So why am I talking about this verb? Well, I believe that verb is, one of the 50 things that Plato is kind of emphasizing in this book. I think that verb is one Plato, as a writer, is deploying quite carefully and on purpose. And in his use of it, he's kind of using that verb to gradually help bring out a meaning, to bring out something he wants you to see. And so using that verb gradually lets him bring that out, and also gradually bringing out that point, starts to invest that verb with a certain kind of meaning. So I think that verb, kathoraho, in the various forms in which it can occur, shows up throughout this book is a sort of one of the characters of the story, although it's never marked as such. Like, nobody ever says, "Oh, look at this verb." But I think that if you do pay careful attention to how it's being used, I think you can learn quite a bit. So that's why I want to bring it out here. So I think that Bloom's translation is not actually correct here, because I think in reading the Greek here, a normal reader would take katidon here to mean looking down, right? The verb in its most straightforward sense. And I think that because I think partially he's trying to bring out these down references, right? I went down looking down, and so on. And just as I was saying, we can reflect philosophically on the notion of going down and gradually bring out its deeper meanings, perhaps even to the point where we'll say the way down and the way up the same. I think here he's giving you the verb katidon, initially giving you a simple meaning, going down, and then over the course of study it's gradually going to become sort of intensified and deepened in its meaning. But anyway, I want to pick up on that. I want to continue nonetheless with this particular idea of kathoraho. So yes, I think that it means looking down here. But as I said, it can mean this thing more like noticing. And I think that's going to be a thing that's going to start to show up almost immediately. The text is going to draw our attention to the very familiar experience of being able to see something that was there but that you weren't seeing before, something like that, right? The experience of being able to look at the same thing, one time seeing it this way, but then another time looking at that same thing and noticing something different. I think that's going to be thematized in the conversations and the drama that are going to unfold in the next few pages. And so, without particularly using that word, kathoraho, we're going to become kind of introduced to or educated in those experiences of almost like seeing something and then having to see it again to see what's really there, something like that. And as we gradually get used to that kind of experience, we will be ready for a later point when that verb starts being used again to name exactly that sort of structure. Now I want to start talking about the one who was looking down on us, namely Polemarchus. He comes up basically 3 times in this introductory book. He comes up right here in a scene we'll discuss in a moment. Then he comes up a couple of pages later and has a substantial philosophical exchange with Socrates. And then he comes up later on in Book I, making a side comment, a little commentary about the conversation that Socrates is having with Thrasymachus. And all 3 of those are important. But I want to introduce him, and I want to introduce him because Plato's writings have characters. They're like stage plays. And yes, they're philosophy, and in that sense they involve ideas and arguments and so on. But they're not like philosophy textbooks. They're not like philosophy journal articles. They don't take the form of someone saying, "Oh, there's a thing I want to prove to you. Here's my thesis. Here are my arguments in support of it," etc., etc. Right? That doesn't happen. The form of the writing overall is interactions, conversations that happen between people in particular occasions. And if you want to understand a Platonic dialogue, and indeed if you want to benefit philosophically from the education these books offer, you have to work very carefully through the form of it. You have to treat them as dramas and get engaged with them as human dramas. And on the basis of your understanding the drama, develop the way into understanding what's happening in those conversations and what the significance of the ideas is, etc., etc. The significance of the things said, what the significance of the things said is. And so I want to start with Polemarchus because I want to say, if you're studying the Republic, you got to figure out who these characters are. I mean, the real players are Socrates, of course, Polemarchus, who we're about to talk about, Polemarchus' father, Cephalus, Thrasymachus, who is a sophist, basically visiting from out of town, and then Glaucon, mentioned by Socrates in that first sentence, who happens to be one of Plato's brothers, half-brothers, and then Glaucon's other brother, Adeimantus. Book I is almost entirely a conversation between Socrates, Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. And then they basically disappear. Those other three disappear. And the rest of the book is mostly, though not exclusively, Socrates talking with Glaucon and Adeimantus. And so I wanted to begin by thinking about Polemarchus. And so the very first one, looking down on us from afar as we were pressing homewards, Polemarchus, the son of Cephalus, ordered his slave to run after us and order us to wait for him. So how is Polemarchus introduced? Well, he's catching sight of us from afar. That's may or may not prove significant, but you see that he has a slave. So there's something introduced there. I mean, at a personal level, it shows he's wealthy. At a cultural level, it shows that he belongs to a society that has slaves, in which slaves are legal. And then what does he do? He orders the slave. So it's not just that he happens to have one or whatever. Like, he treats the slave as a slave. He orders the slave to go do something. And he orders the slave to run after us and order us to wait for him. So it's interesting that Polemarchus has a slave. He orders the slave, but what he orders the slave to do is to deliver a message to Socrates and Glaucon, and the message is an order. So Polemarchus it seems like he's got a little bit of an ordering attitude. And then they agree to wait, and then eventually he comes up, and that ordering attitude is reiterated in the ensuing exchange. Polemarchus says to Socrates and Glaucon, "I guess you two are hurrying to get away to town." And he says, "Do you see how many of us there are? So either you have to prove stronger than these men, if you want to get away and go to town, or else you have to stay here." Now, I imagine that this is a kind of joking exchange between friends. I imagine that. I don't know that. I imagine it because these people do know each other, seems quite well, and friends do talk that way to each other sometimes. But maybe not. This turns out to be almost the first thing that the Republic says. It says Catabane, it says Catadone, and then it says Polemarchus came ordering Socrates around. Didn't have to be there. Why is that in the book? And then I'll draw your attention to something else that I imagine I will talk about later. I won't talk about it particularly right now. But when the slave first came and said to Socrates and Glaucon, Polemarchus orders you to wait. Glaucon says, "Of course we'll wait." So that was addressed to Glaucon and Socrates. And Glaucon answered on behalf of both of them, "We'll wait." Should he have spoken on behalf of Socrates? What would Socrates have said? Glaucon acts as if he is authoritative in speaking on behalf of Socrates. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe Socrates was going to say, "No way, you can't talk to me like that," or "No way, I don't want to see Polemarchus," or who knows what. But we don't know, because Glaucon chose to speak before Socrates could and presents himself as speaking on Socrates' behalf, whether or not he really is entitled to do that. And then that happens again. Polemarchus says, "Unless you're tougher than us, you're not getting out of here today." And Socrates says, "Well, isn't there another possibility? Couldn't we persuade you to let us go?" Because maybe he's going to say, "Yeah, there's a lot of you guys here. You want me to stay, and you're jokingly or not threatening to use force on me. But look, why don't I tell you, I got to get back down because I got a doctor's appointment, or I got a date with a new person I'm really excited about, or my wife and children are waiting for me," or whatever. Like, maybe he's going to say, "Look, you got to appreciate, I got to get back there," and such that people would say, "Okay, yeah, now that I see what's happening, okay, we won't bother you," right? Maybe that's what he was going to do. Isn't there another possibility? Couldn't I persuade you to let us go? And then Polemarchus says, "Could you really persuade if we don't listen?" So that's a third kind of use of force by Polemarchus. First he orders, and then he says, see how many we are? Don't think you can leave unless you think you can overpower us. And then when Socrates tries to make a kind of appeal, Polemarchus says effectively, I'm not open to that. Could you really persuade if we don't listen? And then he says, think it over, bearing in mind we won't listen. He's saying we're closed in principle to that. Now again, this is all easy. It's easy to imagine this is just kind of joking banter. But I want you to notice how consistently a certain kind of attitude is portrayed. Then the point I wanted to make about Glaucon, so that's what's coming from Polemarchus. But so Socrates says, couldn't we persuade you? And Polemarchus answers that question with a question. Could you persuade us if we don't listen? He's talking with Socrates, formulating a question. And that question is addressed to Socrates. And the next line is, there's no way, said Glaucon. So once again, Glaucon speaks on behalf of Socrates, not without Socrates inviting him to do that. Glaucon both speaks in Socrates' place, more obviously here than in the other case. In the other case, when the slave ordered them to wait, he was ordering both of them. So it makes sense that Glaucon, somebody had to speak first. It makes sense that Glaucon would have spoken first. But here, Polemarchus asks Socrates a question, and Glaucon is the one who answers. So speaking about getting to know characters, you get to know something about Glaucon's character here too, as well as getting to know something about Polemarchus' character. Polemarchus says, could you persuade us if we don't listen? And Glaucon says, there's no way. Well, maybe he's right. I would encourage you to think about that yourself. You can see why someone would say that. But the thing I notice is that Socrates didn't get to answer. And I would have been interested to hear how Socrates would have answered that question. The theme of persuasion, and perhaps the theme of listening too, but especially the theme of persuasion, will be a pretty prominent theme throughout this book. So I think even though it's sort of superficially, it makes sense to say you can't persuade someone who doesn't listen, I think the depths of study that we're going to get into will reveal that there's a little more complexity. There's a lot more complexity to that issue than that simple interpretation notices. So, I guess this is a little bit more like seeing versus really seeing, right? If we look more deeply at the issue, the answer might appear differently. So we are going to be led to doing something like that kathora o ourself when it comes to persuasion. And maybe this answer would appear differently to a deeper seeing. Maybe we would catch sight of a different answer if we went through this more carefully. Anyway, I want to bring that out about Glaucon. So just in terms of getting to know the characters, both Polemarchus and Glaucon have entered onto the scene here, and they both kind of showed something about themselves and about who they are. And Polemarchus then really has his most important showing, starting at 331d. He's the son of Cephalus, who's a resident alien, wealthy shield manufacturer, and so on. And there's a little conversation with Cephalus that I'm going to come back to at another point. Polemarchus comes up here because Cephalus has said some things about what justice is. That's come up in the conversation with Socrates. It's not how the thing started, but that's where their conversation got to. And Socrates asked Cephalus a question because Cephalus has said one thing, and then Socrates said, well, that doesn't seem right for this reason. And so Socrates says, so isn't what you said wrong? And then before Cephalus really answers, Polemarchus jumps in. So Socrates says, can your definition really be right given this problem I've seen? And Polemarchus says, it most certainly is, Socrates, at least if Simonides should be believed at all. And in fact, I should quote what Socrates says in reporting the story. It most certainly is, Socrates, interrupted Polemarchus, at least if Simonides should be believed at all. Again, just as a little flag, I think the theme of interruption is going to be pretty important in this. Kind of for that reason I already gave about Glaucon. Notice when you're hearing an answer from someone other than the person who was asked, or something like that. You might have wanted to hear what this character would say, but you got this character instead. Well, similarly here, Socrates asked Cephalus a question, and you don't get Cephalus's answer, you get Polemarchus bursting in and saying, I'll answer that, and here's the answer. And then, anyway, then his most significant exchange with Socrates occurs. So that's where it happened. And so what is the exchange about? I mean, Cephalus had more or less said that he's happy that he's wealthy because it lets him not do anything unjust because he can pay people back. So Socrates sort of says, is that right? Paying back debts, giving back what someone gave you. Is that what justice is? And he gives a particular example. He says, what if you had a friend who loaned you his weapons, his sword or whatever, but then your friend went crazy? Right? He gave you his sword. So if you're just supposed to give back what somebody's given you, then it'd seem like you should give your sword back to that guy. But that wouldn't seem just because he's crazy. He's going to go hurt himself or hurt other people. So Socrates says, wouldn't it be right in that case? Wouldn't the just thing be to not give it back to him? And Cephalus had also said, it's good to tell the truth. And Socrates says, and also wouldn't you not tell this guy what you're doing and why? So he says, so Cephalus, as to this very thing, justice, should we so simply assert that it is the truth and giving back what a man has taken from another? Or is to do these things sometimes just and sometimes unjust? Could those same actions be just in some context and unjust in another context? And then he says, take this case as an example of what I mean. I mean, everyone would surely say that if a man takes weapons from a friend when the latter is of sound mind, and the friend demands them back when he is mad, one shouldn't give back such things, and the man who gave them back would not be just. And moreover, one should not be willing to tell someone in this state the whole truth. Right? So giving back and telling the truth in this case would seem to be the opposite of justice. Justice would seem to be refusing to give back and lying. And Cephalus agrees with the example. He says, yeah, what you say is right. And so then Socrates says, but then this isn't the definition of justice, speaking the truth and giving back what one takes. Right? If that's the definition you gave, it seems like that can't be right. And that's when Polemarchus comes in and interrupts it. I bring up that particular case not just because they're going to go talk about justice, which is what that's about, but because I think there are some things already to notice in that little bit of an exchange with Cephalus that are going to be relevant to what Polemarchus says. And so let's talk a little bit about the exchange Socrates and Polemarchus have about justice, and we'll come back to that. So Polemarchus begins by talking about something Simonides said, and according to Polemarchus, what Simonides said is that it is just to give to each what is owed, ta opheil omina. And Socrates has an interesting response to that. He says, it's not easy to disbelieve a Simonides. He is a wise and divine man. So that's the first thing Socrates says about Simonides, who's a famous Greek poet. And you would remember from the Apology that wisdom and the divine are the things that Socrates is most concerned about. So this is what he says about Simonides. He could be joking, I suppose, but that's what he says. And then he says, however, you, Polemarchus, perhaps know what on earth he means, but I don't understand. So it's interesting. Socrates heard the words, it is just to give to each what is owed. Socrates doesn't fail to be fluent in the Greek language. He understands those words. But even though he understands the words, he says he doesn't know what it means. So I emphasize that because that's now an example of that structure I was talking about. That in getting the words, you haven't yet got what's being said to you. Or at least that's the claim Socrates is making. So I was talking about kathoraho as being, a seeing that goes beyond what you immediately see to get, something different, where you really notice what's really there or something like that. Well, here, using seeing metaphorically in the context of talking about understanding, it seems like you're getting that exact structure. Yeah, I see the thing. I see the words. I hear the words. I understand the words, but I don't really understand what they're trying to communicate. So he's saying his point is there's something yet to be seen in what you're already seeing. Socrates then goes on, and he does say this a little bit later. He said, after they're going to figure out what he means, well, it seems that Simonides made a riddle. He enigmatized after the fashion of poets. So again, now Socrates is talking about the way poets write. And he's saying here that the very nature of poetic writing is to be enigmatic. So it seems to me that remark is very similar to his earlier remark when he said, Sophocles is a wise and divine man. It's not easy to disbelieve him, but you also don't automatically know what he means when he says something. And this remark here seems to be much the same. And I want to remind you again that attitude toward the wisdom and the divine, towards wisdom and the divine, is pretty much exactly the one Socrates puts on display in the Apology, because that's how he responds to the Delphic oracle when the oracle says, no one is wiser than Socrates. And Socrates is like, yeah, I hear the words. I know what every one of the words means. I can grasp the English sense of the sentence, but I don't know what it's saying. But he also, as he says, it's not easy to disbelieve a Simonides. It's like, it's not easy to disbelieve the Delphic oracle. So he's like, okay, I'm presented with something that I have reason to think is, wise and divine. But though I can see it, I can't really see what I'm seeing in seeing it. And Socrates' life mission then was basically to interpret that sentence, that no one is wiser than Socrates. So that structure that you see Socrates enacting throughout his life, according to his autobiographical speech in the Apology, seems to me to be exactly the kind of thing he's saying here. Right? So I think it's not just a passing sort of thought. I think there's a important part of Socrates' point being brought out here about certain kinds of writing, certain kinds of artistic work or whatever, and what they demand of it. And it is that structure of, though you see something, you haven't really seen it, right? That there is a deeper kind of seeing that's called for, which is that theme I raised initially with that verb kathorao. And now what is that meaning that they got out of Simonides? Well, they have a little bit of a discussion here, and he says, well, it doesn't, Polemarchus says, yeah, it doesn't really mean you just give back someone whatever they gave you. That's not the point. Simonides is saying, what is just, when you say it's just to give someone what is owed, it's just to give something that is fitting to them or appropriate to them. And Socrates says, okay, right, well, he doesn't say this, but the point is, okay, that has advanced our understanding of what this means. It's very different to think of giving what it is owed. It's very different to think of that as a sort of matter of addition and subtraction, like mathematically giving back the amount you got, on the one hand, versus having a responsibility to something that you must deal with it in an appropriate way. It's very different meanings. Both, of course, could quite straightforwardly be are quite straightforwardly interpretations of the notion of giving something what it is owed. But they're very different understandings of what debt is, and correspondingly what is responsible behavior. And indeed, as Socrates made clear with his example about the guy who's mad, those two different interpretations of what is owed are actually deeply opposed. Because if you rely on the mathematical sort of view, give back whatever was given to you, then you have to do something, like give the sword back to the guy who's gone crazy. You have to do the very thing that on the other interpretation of doing what is fitting would be completely unjust. So these are not trivial matters of interpretation. So one thing that they show then is that the very meaning of the word owe, to owe, or to pay back a debt or whatever, but the very meaning of that is not immediately apparent. It doesn't just lie there on the surface, right? Already we've seen that word requires us to do some work to figure out what is being said when that word is being used. Partially because different people could use it in different ways, but also we could say because the word itself has its own depth of meaning. So there again, you're seeing something like that structure that I was associating with the verb kathorao. And not only with respect to the word owe, but now the point being made is that justice is itself a matter of doing exactly that thing, because justice, in this case, according to the definition that Polemarchus is bringing out from Simonides, justice amounts to judging about something what is fitting. And so you don't automatically know what to do. Guy gave me a sword. Should I give it back or not? Just listing the external facts, so to speak, can't answer the question. You actually have to see beyond those facts to grasp the character of the situation, the nature of the situation, and use that to judge the event in question, giving the sword back or not, to see whether it's just or not. The relevant example that that Polemarchus gives for judging the deeper nature is figuring out whether the person you're dealing with is a friend or an enemy. Because he says, really, justice means doing well by your friends and doing harm to your enemies. And in each case, you are giving to that person what is owed, even though the thing you'll be giving is exactly the opposite. Right? If it's in war and someone is going to try to put a sword into your friend, you're going to stop it. If it's in that same war and someone's trying to put a sword into your enemy, you're going to help it go in. Right? And according to the view Polemarchus is putting forward here, both of those are just. Right? So justice in that case takes the form of two completely opposed actions, depending on the context. But that means you can't tell just by looking at the action whether it's just or not, the isolated action of putting a sword into someone. You can't tell just by looking at a person whether that's the right thing or not. Right? You have to see deeper in both cases, right, to be able to evaluate whether that action is or is not fitting. Right? It's a matter of fit, and fitting is a matter of fitting one thing to another thing. Right? So you have to be evaluating a relationship. That's very different than saying, I got a sword, I got to give a sword back. So I want to make one more point about that then, and that is that in terms of this seeing deeply and so on, and all of these structures that I'm bringing out, you can notice then that justice itself it's neither one of those actions nor the other, but that justice itself can take opposed forms. Right? So sticking a sword into a person can be just, sticking a sword into a person can be unjust. Not sticking a sword into a person can be just, not sticking a sword into a person can be unjust, right? Both P and not P can be just or unjust, depending on the circumstances. So the very nature of justice, then, is that it is not identifiable with any specific little action. There's no thing that is to be done. You can't get a rule that says always do this. Right? The justice itself remains justice only, by appearing in these opposed forms. And it is also not equatable with any of them. I also wanted to bring out one other remark he makes in here, and that's about the nature of money. And he says, they're talking about money, and he distinguishes the having of money from the spending of money. And you can go back and see the context for that. But the only point I want to make there was I want you to notice this idea of money as something that we say people have. But, to have money, you have to precisely not use it. And whenever you use it, you buy this or that particular thing. So money is kind of, generically when you have it, it is the possession of purchasing. It is the power to purchase. So you have a certain quantity of the power to purchase. But in having it, you can't actually be purchasing anything. You just have to be holding it in reserve. Whereas to use your money is always to purchase something or other. So you take the possibility of purchasing and turn it into actual purchases. I wanted to bring that out. I just wanted to name that just because I think you can see in that structure of money another example of that thing that we were saying about justice, with the idea that justice sort of gets realized in different forms, but it itself can't be any one of those specific forms. I wanted to bring that out just because you're so familiar with money. You see it all the time. And I wanted you to be able to see a familiar thing in reality, in your reality, that has the structure of the sort he's talking about, and to hold that together then with these other remarks about justice and indeed about this general theme of kathorao, or seeing through. I want to bring out a couple of further things from this conversation. I'm not going through it in detail and analyzing all the exchanges, but I want to bring out, some of these things that are revealed through the conversation, even though they're not what the conversation is about. So notice there, the thing I am trying to do in reading is yet another version of that kathorao. So what is the basic conversation, right? So we know where it was left with Cephalus. Give things back and tell the truth. Oh, but here's a case where it seems like the opposite is right. So that definition can't be right. And Polemarchus then says, well, we can still save the definition by giving it a more subtle interpretation based on Simonides. And that is doing what is fitting to a particular type of person. And the relevant kinds of people he picks out are friends and enemies. It's hard to believe that anybody doesn't know what friends and enemies are. It's hard to believe that anybody doesn't have friends and enemies, both at a personal level and at a larger social and cultural level. It's often nice to say, wouldn't it be nice if everybody got along? But it's easy to put that in words. It doesn't seem to have much relationship to the realities of human life. It's a real thing that in the course of virtually any human life, any person will be called upon to take a stand for or against something. And whatever that thing is that they're taking a stand against, in taking a stand against that issue, you will be taking a stand against a body of people, right? Namely the people who stand for that. And in taking a stand for something, you're going to be taking a stand against a body of people too, namely the people who take a stand against it. So we're called to make commitments, to take a stand on things. And indeed, remember, that's if you read the Apology, that is Socrates' description of like the most fundamental, most moral human thing we're called upon to do, just to take a stand. That's right after his direct exchange with Miletus, where he sort of tries to answer Miletus' charges, and then he goes on to say, kind of in his own terms, what he believes. And that's the first thing he says. You got to take a stand. Think about that. People have to take a stand. And if you have to take a stand, that means you got to have friends and enemies. There wouldn't be a need to take a stand if there weren't going to be opposition. One of the things that comes up right off the bat with these first exchanges is you're not going to be able to talk about justice very seriously if you don't talk about the human conflicts that are endemic, intrinsic to human relationships and human affairs. And Polemarchus' point is, you have to deal with people differently in that case. You have to deal with your allies in one way, and you have to deal with your enemies in another way. At a certain level, that seems like that's got to be right. But just as at a certain level, when Cephalus says, you should pay back your debts and tell the truth, at a certain level, that's got to be right. But when Cephalus says that in that simple way, it's not hard to come up with an example that suddenly makes it look wrong, and therefore, your sense of what it means to say that has to be deepened. And that's what Polemarchus does. Well, now Polemarchus says, look, you got to do what's fitting, and at a basic level, that's crucially going to mean deciding who your friends are and who your enemies are, what you're going to take a stand on, and dealing with those people differently. As I say, it's hard not to see that as in some significant way right. But in what sense it's right is then in need of further investigation, because once again, Socrates comes back pretty quickly and says, well, okay, that sounds all right, but how did Polemarchus put it? Well, do good things for your friends and harm your enemies. And Socrates then basically tries to nail him on that question of harming your enemies. He says, you go around hurting people. What are you going to do? And he says, you're going to make them worse people. To hurt a person is to hurt them as a person. So you go around hurting people, you're going to worsen them as people, which means they're going to make them more unjust. And indeed, he says there, isn't justice human virtue? It's easy to overlook that line, but that's a big line. He's saying being just is in a way the fulfillment of what it is to be a person. That's the distinctive human capacity. That's the distinctive domain of human life. That's, if you've read the Apology, Socrates, if you ever want to know what Socrates thinks about justice, read the Apology. It tells you in deep and clear and subtle detail how to think about these issues. It's very powerful and very moving. And so when he says here, isn't justice human virtue, that's kind of a one-sentence summary of what he's said richly and fully in the Apology. So if you're hurting someone, you're actually making them a worse person, which means you're going to be making them more unjust, which is a familiar idea, right? That damaged bad people don't come because they have a bad gene. It comes from the fact that they weren't treated very well. You treat people poorly, and you damage their capacity to be good people. And so Socrates says it doesn't make sense to say that justice means making some people bad people. So while it might be true that what you owe friends and what you owe enemies is different, he's saying it can't be right that what you owe enemies is to treat them in a way that destroys their humanity. Pretty rich and interesting point. And as I say, it's another example of taking an idea that is pretty immediately compelling and where you think there's something true about that I got to hold on to, and seeing something about how it needs to be deepened. Anyway, that's the way their conversation goes. And Polemarchus ends up agreeing with that, which is quite interesting. And so by the end of the conversation, Polemarchus has basically agreed to all of the things that Socrates has brought up in their conversation, and in a pretty significant way has kind of changed his view. He can still hold on to that sentence, doing justice, doing what is fitting, giving people what they owe, but he has had to change his view about how to treat enemies. Doesn't mean you can't fight your enemies. Doesn't mean you can't have enemies. Doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with them somehow differently than with how you deal with your friends. But the way Polemarchus was construing that, like that you can harm them, you can be mean to them, you can be unjust to them. That's the thing he had to change. Anyways, that's the basic conversation. And I've already brought out, so that basic point is really great. I've already brought out some of a deeper layer I'm sort of seeing there about some relationships that are put on display. And so I want to note one more sort of large structural thing and bring out one particular point. And I think that's probably all I want to say about Polemarchus. The larger structural thing is that, if you have read the Apology, you can remember that Socrates' life practice is to talk with people to help them explore and investigate their own views, typically discovering thereby that they don't really have very coherent views, and they see problems in the way they think about things. So he says, people tell him what he thinks, he asks them questions about it. The questions he asks them reveal the problems in their views, and what that should result in is the person saying, I have to reconsider my views, and should lead to them changing their views and, becoming better people and all the rest. But he says, that's not always what happens. I talk to people this way, and when through conversation with me, people are confronted with their own ignorance or their own errors, instead of being inspired by that to learn, they just get mad and they blame me for making fools of them or something like that. Maybe that's why he was ultimately sentenced to death by the Athenian court. And you can see that structure he describes played out by various people in the dialogues at various points. This little exchange with Polemarchus I think is quite interesting, because I think it's not very long, it's only a few pages, but I think it's an exemplary case of exactly that thing Socrates describes. This guy eagerly puts forward his view pretty forcefully. Socrates takes it seriously but asks him some tough questions about it. The question reveals some problems in that view. But rather than getting mad, Polemarchus is like, I'm gonna fix that. And many interlocutors will try that once or so. But then it happens again, and it gets to the point where Polemarchus is really in a bind. But he doesn't get mad. He actually says, "You're right, Socrates. I have to change the way I think about that." And so it's exactly the thing Socrates says should happen. I can't off the top of my head think of another place where it happens quite like that in a Platonic dialogue. So I was asking you what kind of person Polemarchus is. First he's kind of bossy, whatever that meant. Here he puts on display something pretty interesting in the way he carries out this conversation, I think. So I think those are the only things I want to really bring out about this particular conversation, Polemarchus with Socrates. I've tried to sort of say what the overall conversation is. I've talked about Polemarchus' character, and I've also talked about, through all of this thematizing of this structure of sort of seeing through, and what the character of that thing is that you see through too, where with justice, like with money, you're seeing something that is a kind of, it's a self-defined meaning, like it's a clear meaning, but it's something that is only realized, that is realized in specific and opposed forms, right? But though it is itself not identifiable with any of them. So I've been trying to bring out that structure. And then I'll just mention this last one. As I said, Polemarchus also comes up again in the context of talking with Socrates talking with Thrasymachus, when Thrasymachus, he seems like a little bit of not a little bit. He's a bit of a dishonest arguer, and he sets up a conversation on one set of terms, and then when he gets an answer he doesn't like, he just changes the terms. So in that way, he seems quite opposite to what we were just noticing about Polemarchus, who seems to really follow through on this idea of critically reflecting on himself when he runs into conflict, as that Socrates had asked for. And basically, you see Polemarchus here kind of call out Thrasymachus for dishonestly changing the terms in his argument. So that's worth considering again independently, and especially when we think about Thrasymachus. But I just wanted to mention it again as another place where you can think about who Polemarchus is and what his character is and the role he plays as an interlocutor.